we have to give a bit of attention to that bottom paragraph on 53. The very ambivalence that mediates faith to us is an invitation to an active rather than passive appropriation of faith. If faith were mediated through absolutes of unquestioned clarity, then we might be believers stamped by rote with correct belief, but we would hardly be faithful. To be faithful is to accept the challenge of ambivalence and ambiguity by coming to judgments and decisions. There's a risk to faith. Incarnational Christianity calls us to participate in the forging of faith as well as the living of faith. Just some good reflections there. So, we think from the midst of things. God meets us in the midst of things. But middle of 54, she transitions from like our location and our knowledge to thinking regarding God's knowledge. So if we posit a provisional and partial knowledge, nature to our own knowledge, middle of 54, we need not posit the same limitations to God. Rather, I suggest that were it not for the fullness of God's knowledge of the world, then the incarnational and providential work of God in the world would not be possible. And it is precisely the fullness of God's knowledge of the world that is the basis of maintaining that violation of the world is a violation of God as well. Two things to say here. I guarantee you that when she talks about God's knowledge of the world not having the same limitations as our knowledge, did I say I guarantee? I pretty strongly would argue that she does not have what we call the future in mind. We've talked about that a little bit, right? With open theism. One of the places where open theism and process thought overlap pretty consistently and coherently is in thinking about God's knowledge to or relationship to what we call the future. In the process model, because the world itself is deeply creative, and she's going to talk about that some more in a minute, and that God's creativity is so deeply entangled in that creativity of the world, the future simply cannot be known. There are too many contingent factors, relations, events that are always occurring that go into the next moment that it cannot ever really be known in principle. It does not yet exist, and therefore it cannot be known, even if we were to say that God has some really good ideas about that, but we'll let's go back here. Oh, the other thing then is, I think the other thing is simply this, that this view of God does include that God truly does know and feels everything. This is, of course, a direct implication already of traditional doctrines of omnipresence, that God is present everywhere, and omniscience, that God knows all things. If God is present everywhere, and meaning deeply, deeply present, then the nature of God's knowing of everything will be deeply intimate, and means that God in some way participates in the experience of all events and creatures everywhere all the time. And as she'll say a little bit later, God knows the world as it is, for what it is. And thus we can say all of the pain and violence and abuse and apathy and hunger and, injustice, and the list goes on, that seem to permeate our world and our experience, are truly known by God and known in a deeply feeling way. I like that a lot. And that's why, again, sin against creation, she's saying, or violation of the world, is a violation of God as well. She unpacks that a little bit more on page 56. So I'm going to start at the top paragraph, about halfway down of 56. Whether we speak of the becoming of conscious or non-conscious creatures, this whole process is an intense instance of creativity. Creation is a process that involves enormous creativity within that process. That which we normally call nature is not inert, but incredibly active. Thus, whether one wishes to have reference to God or not, one legitimately calls nature creation. She may be fudging a little bit on the traditional notion of creation there, but we'll go with her for now. I like this. The third aspect, whereby one legitimately names nature as creation, reflects a somewhat more traditional theological theme. God's creativity interacts with the world's creativity. The world is a welter of interrelating particles, with each emerging actuality responsible for unifying the multitudinous energies from its past. Again, that's good process philosophy right there. Apart from some limiting factor, the magnitude of the past would simply overwhelm creativity. If there were no way to sift through all of this weltering, what was the word she used? I forgot already. Welter of interrelating particles, we'd be overwhelmed. Producing but a sheer randomness of energy. But a principle of limitation necessarily must relate to all energies and not just to some energies. A principle of limitation can only operate effectively from its own comprehension of the entire complexity and from some capacity for envisagement or envisioning of what such energies in various combinations can become. That principle is God. So I'll read a little more. Pretty dense, but good stuff. Insofar as God is a providential energy affecting every emerging actuality, that means like including you in this moment, right? As it copes with the problem of selectively integrating its past, in this moment, in this very moment as you listen to this, you are in this act, if process thought is correct, of trying to, in a sense, take all that's flowing into you, all of your history, all of the universe that's preceded and flows into you, and integrate it into this present moment that's happening as you listen to this sentence. Wow. God is creator. This mode of creation, however, cannot be wholly determinative. God doesn't determine the next moment, since it is a creative impulse or influence that requires the becoming entity's response for actualization. Your active participation is always happening in every moment. Thus, in this relational ontology, and ontology, of course, means like understanding or philosophy of what it means to exist, what is being. This relational notion of being, God's creation of the world is a creation with the world, rather than a simple creation of the world. And God's mode of creation is through influence. And I do love that word. The etymology is lovely. I think it comes from French terms that basically to influence means to flow into. Isn't that beautiful? So in some way we could say God flows into each moment of everything, not to determine that moment, but present as a calling, a come this way type thing, we could say, with no guarantee that any creature at any moment is going to say, oh, okay, I'll do that, right? And thus, we have right here a process theodicy. God's creation of the world is a creation with the world rather than a simple creation of the world. So God cannot dictate what occurs in the world. God can, we almost want to use a term like hope. God hopes to influence the world in every moment. God's mode of creation is through influence. Yeah. So if right across the page, 57, and I think we'll close this off pretty quick here. When this is taken into view, the interpretation of sin as being against God becomes less what one has done with the aim of God, this calling in every moment, and more about what one has done to God, as God receives the effects of one's deeds into God's own experience, because remember, God knows all things fully. I don't know that we'd have to say it's less to do with the aim and more with what God has done to, or what we have done to God. I would say that you could say both, and you'd be okay there. I think I'm going to say that's good. I think if you look on page 61, there's some real interesting things about divine creativity within creaturely creation's creativity, and the development of Homo sapiens. But finally, she does say, if God exercises a creative influence on the earth's own creative responses to existence, and creative response to existence would include the presence of God within and through those modes of existence in calling us to become what we might become, what's possible for us at any moment, then we must posit that God did indeed lure the earth toward the emergence of our own species. Wow. Maybe I'll finish that paragraph and that'll be it. This is middle of 61. Thus, not only in the small sense of initial aims, that is, again, in every moment, this initial aim idea is that in every moment God takes what the world gives, you could say, and out of that receiving of the world shapes the next best possible moment for this complex world in all of its details. I mean, this is actually a rather massive doctrine of God, in which we find that God has something really important to do all the time. It's not just creating in some past moment and then kind of looking over things. This is a very different model. So not only in the sense of initial aims, but also in the larger sense of the evolution of the cosmos. That's the whole universe, right? Always, however, this needs to be interpreted not only in terms of God's influence, but also in terms of, and notice she went from, in terms of the earth's response. But again, this isn't just the earth. In fact, the earth is such a tiny, teeny tiny sliver of this massive web of existence. Wow. Maybe just one more here. Also in 61, end of the last full paragraph. Thus, God not only has an influence upon the world, but this influence stems from the prior way, right, in which the world has influenced God. God, like every other entity, feels the world. What we could say is that, unlike every other entity, God consciously in every moment feels that world. God knows that world, in a way that no other entity can. God's knowledge, like that of every other entity, is based on the fullness of God's feelings. And this is the basis of saying that rebellion against the well-being of the world is always also a violation of God, who feels the world. Of course, then, if it's a violation of the well-being of the world, the next question in the next chapter is, well, what do we think the well-being of the world is? If sin is ultimately this violence against the world's well-being, it would help us to know what we think well-being implies. Thank you for your patience, and I hope this little journey is at least helpful in unpacking a little bit of the rather adventurous model called process relational thought that Marjorie Suchocki has been such a champion of over the last 4 or 5 decades. Blessings.